Welcome everybody. It's great pleasure to be here for this session for Davos 2025. We're going to be debating migration and demography. Now, the session itself will have a very different format compared to some of the sessions that you might have participated here at Davos. We will include the audience here with us in the room, but also the audience who are watching the stream live while using the slide. Everybody in the room can also use that. We're going to throw some questions, and we really want to get your views on some of the most pressuring issues when it comes to migration and demography that we are going to be discussing for the next 45 minutes. It is my great pleasure to introduce the esteemed speakers here at the session. Thérèse Kayikwamba Wagner, Minister of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Democratic Republic of the Congo. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
Miguel, Medina, Minister of Investment of Honduras and Young Global Leader. Minister, thank you for being here. And Amy Pope, Director General, International Organization for Migration. Thank you for being here, Amy. My name is Sasha Vakulina. I'm Euronews correspondent, and I'm going to be moderating this session for WEF today. And it is my great pleasure to have you all here. There are some estimates that migration could help generate over $20 trillion a year in economic output by 2050. But others worry about the financial and systemic pressure it can put governments and local communities. Now, in this town hall, together with the speakers here in the middle, together with all of you in the room, what we want to do, we want to debate the effects of migration at a local, national, but also at the global level altogether. Of course, with this being such an important topic here in Davos, but also outside of Davos, same way. So I want to open this session with actually a slide, a question, just to get you all more accustomed. I don't know if you've used it yet here at Davos. Let's do. You have the code. So you can join it with the hashtag WEF25. This is also the hashtag that we're encouraging everybody to use if you want to reach out to us via social media, and you can use that when we're going to be able to see that.
Yeah, 100%.
There we go. Do you think governments are doing enough to prepare for the demographic shifts caused by migration? Now, this is a yes or no question. We just have now 100% for no, but I guess people are just connecting. That probably means that, one person answered with no. That's the great thing about having slide. I would like to keep it for a few minutes. Please open there, because I want to see how it's changing. And also, I'm going to ask you this question, and it will be very interesting to see if you can convince the others to change their minds regarding it's a yes or a no. So Minister, let me start with you. Do you think governments are doing enough? Is it a yes or no?
It's never a yes or no, but I think more can be done.
If you had to vote,
I would say more can be done, so I would lean more towards a no, because I come from a country where we have a lot of challenges that are linked to migration, be it forced migration, which is conflict-related, or migration which is voluntary and which deprives us at the end as a country, but also as a continent, from the rich potential that our youth and that the rest of our population, of course, can bring to the table. So I think there's much more that can be done, both at the end of the countries, if you want, where people are departing from, but also when we are confronted to the realities that members of our diaspora face in host countries, I think also there more can be done. So it's definitely a global question that should engage reflections from all sides.
Yeah, 100%. Minister, what's your take on that? You see, and look, it's changing now. There we go. That's why I love having this question open during the session. What's your take on that? Do you think governments are doing enough?
Yes, I think there's a lot that can be done. I definitely think that governments are not doing enough to stop migration. From my perspective, coming from more of an origin country, I believe that there's initiatives that help tackle this problem. But in our side of the world, in our region, the problem is keeping our people. I mean, in the international arena, you can see more of the critics of why all the bad people are leaving our country and going into better markets. But in essence, we are worried about our good people are leaving our country, and that's where I see that much more work needs to be done.
Amy, what's your
this
side?
This is not even a question. No government
I knew
is
that you'd
doing
say
enough
that.
to prepare for the demographic shifts. And I love you guys both, but you're not. And I certainly see that play out all around the world. No one is doing enough to prepare. And in fact, we're at this moment in time where the migration rhetoric is dangerously misaligned with the reality. And I think, and I'm going to be provocative here because it's important to have a conversation, I think it's putting governments all across the world at a strategic disadvantage, and it will harm their populations in the long run unless we start to be thinking about this question realistically.
Let's talk a little bit more about this narrative, as you said, and the way it's changing and shifting. What's your take on that regarding how dangerous that change can be?
You look at the 30 of the top economies in 2023, they all had labor shortages. We just had a conversation 2 minutes ago about Honduras. Honduras has labor shortages. Uruguay has labor shortages. Mexico had labor shortages.
Yeah.
But the conversation in the Americas is all about how do we stop migration. It's the same thing playing out in Europe. You have populations that are aging. In places like Portugal and Spain and Italy, they simply do not have the workforce they need to meet their own development goals. Likewise, in the Republic of Korea or Japan, they're aging so rapidly, they are not going to have the population to sustain the elderly population, much less their business and economic goals. So nobody is really thinking about how do we address this cliff that we're all about to fall off of. At the same time, we have lots of young people coming up, especially across the continent in Africa, and we do not have jobs aligned with the skills. In some parts of Africa, we have highly skilled young people who can't find jobs in the markets. In other places, we have lower skilled people who cannot find jobs in their home country. So we really need to be looking at this globally, regionally, in a very, very different way.
Minister, we talked about it. You mentioned the aspect of exactly high potential people migrating and this specific focus for your country.
Exactly. It is particularly concerning when you look at the DRC, a country with a population of over 100 million people and over 50% of them being below 25 years. This is immense human capital, and the challenge is seeing how we harness this immense human capital, but also how we harness it while bearing in mind precisely the big trends that Amy was talking about. So at the same time, we see that there will be a shortage in terms of workforce globally. What does that mean for us? What is the aspiration that we have for our population? What are the opportunities that we want to open up to them? How do we see and how do we make sure that we set them up for success? And how do we make sure that our next generations contribute to development, contribute to innovation, but also do not end up being only used as a cheap workforce because the rest of the world is running out of it. And so it's really the challenge of us globally projecting ourselves into our development patterns, our economic patterns, and acknowledging this reality that our demographics are going to change very dramatically. And at the same time, we still believe to have certain values, certain principles, certain beliefs when it comes to human rights, when it comes to human dignity. How do we uphold them in a changing setting? How do we make sure that when workforce shortages manifest in certain parts of the world that are better developed, that are better off, how do we make sure that these requirements are not put onto other regions, but then with lower standards? How do we make sure that these values that have been fought for, also in Europe, also in North America and other parts of the world, how do we maintain these very important standards throughout the world while workforce patterns and their geolocalization, if you want, change and shift? So I think this is a big challenge for Africa in general, in terms of how we project ourselves in this changing demographics and in these economic patterns that are bound to change, and how do we make sure that our next generations are well taken care of?
Well, Minister, your portfolio comes with investment, so you do have a lot to say when it comes to exactly the economic effects of that and that very aspect.
Yes, no, for our region, migration is, I would like to say, like an unnecessary evil. In the sense necessary. Why? Because of our economy. 25% of our GDP depends on remittances that come from our Hondurans abroad.
Right.
But it's a problem, or it poses a lot of challenges because it creates a culture of depending on this external income, and this brings a series of problems on our workforce, on our population. But it also, one of the second largest challenges that we have is that it's not our bad people that are migrating, is our skilled force, the people that had education, that are getting much better payment abroad. And so right now we're facing a critical problem with skilled force in our country. We do not have enough employees to keep the country or the development at the rate that we need.
Amen.
So, in response to that, first of all, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge how migration can actually drive development. So what the minister is talking about here is the fact that we have these inefficiencies in the system. So his most skilled Hondurans are being pulled into markets where they're being paid higher wages, and they are not getting the incentives to return. So we can't stop people from moving, right? Humans are migratory. That's the way that we're built, right?
But we can still try somehow to intervene
Absolutely.
in some of those policies regarding...
Yes, but you cannot, I mean, I'm not going to be too provocative, but I will say, look at all the experiments that every country has tried to stop people from migrating out. It's very, very difficult. Instead, it's how do you create incentives for people to migrate in, or how do you create migration patterns that are more circular so that people who can go and get the skills, learn new technology, build the networks, learn the languages, and then bring it back in to fuel development at home. So I don't know if you know, the foreign minister of the DRC is the best example of that. Right? She is someone, and we've met so many people like this who around the world get the education, engage with the private sector, she's a fellow UN, work with UN agencies, and then bring all of that back in to the country and drive the development in the country. That's a kind of magic that migration can catalyze when we stop thinking about it as a zero-sum game and we start thinking about it as a tool for development.
Yeah, we call it the migration magic. We're going to put that on slide.
I like that. Okay.
That sounds good, doesn't it? That sounds like a hashtag there. Minister, but, you know, of course, in all countries, in all continents, you're going to still see people migrating and that you can't stop it and motivate to this. But in your case, lots of that migration is conflict-driven. That's another. You can't tackle that. That's a different case. And, you know, at the latest WEF Global Risks report, we've seen what comes as number one. We are talking about state-based armed conflict as the top imminent risk identified for this year. That's a different case as well.
And it's a quite dramatic one because of its repercussions on the human capital. When you look at the situation in Eastern DRC, we're looking at one of the most dramatic internal displacement crises, and I think Amy Pope can also testify to that. With over 7 million internally displaced civilians. So this has also dramatic repercussions on development potential, right? What does that mean when we have generations in a conflict that has been ongoing for nearly 30 years? What does that mean when you have generations that are actually used to these patterns of displacement? Generations that are actually even conditioned, if you want, to be perpetually displaced because of conflict. How does that reflect onto their own projection and their willingness to invest in long-term objectives? What does that mean at the national level for us as a country that is aspiring to have greater development, to have innovation, to tap into that very important human capital? But also, what does that mean for us as a continent that seeks to emerge, as a continent that seeks also to tap into its own human capital? So we also know that migration magic can lead to innovation. Migration magic can lead to integration. It can lead to people understanding each other, culture flourishing, so many things, so much wealth. But at the same time, we are robbing ourselves of that wealth at a continental level on the African continent when we have these recurring conflicts. So this is also a question that we need to ask ourselves on the African continent. What are we losing when we still are not able or willing to harness and to clamp down, if you want, on conflicts, on state-driven conflicts, and on their repercussions, not just on our national economies, but on our continental development and our potential to grow as a continent. Because at the end of the day, when you have state-driven violence, you have also an erosion of the trust between people and between states. So in my case, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, someone might come and say, well, why don't we make it visa-free? Why don't we open up the borders so that everybody can come and we can, just be one big happy family and tap into that famous migration magic, right? Well, we can't. Right. Because we are currently in a situation of conflict that is opposing us to many of our neighbors. So at the same time, these realities do not only represent threats for our countries, but also for our continent. So it is something that should compel us at a continental level to also rethink the choices that we have made, the choices that some have made, and to what extent they actually harm us on the longer term, in terms also of our human capital. Because then the only option that capital sees is leaving the continent altogether. And this is the greatest loss for us, because even when you come from the DRC, which has the world's second lung, which has the most cobalt, which has the most lithium, and so on and so forth, diamonds and whatever, our biggest wealth are still the Congolese. So our biggest loss is every Congolese who is displaced or who has, who feels compelled to leave and not to come back.
I want to ask next, I'm going to wait a little bit, a minute. Okay, 87, we're managing to convince few people here. Oh no, okay, that's what I mean. When the moment I start, okay, we're going to keep it there. So do you think governments are doing enough to prepare for the demographic shifts caused by migration? We have 83% thinking no, but we do have 17% saying yes, the governments are doing enough. Before we go to the next part, I want to talk about, the perceived benefits of a more open migration policy. Some of them we have just mentioned, but also I want to bring up, when it comes to migration narrative, we need to bring up also the big elephant in the room and the way it is changing and the way it's changing across all the continents and globally. And now we've heard a complete change as well on the migration policy from Donald Trump. And this is a completely different narrative, Amy.
Yes. I think, though, we all have to recognize that when populations see others come across their border in an unregulated way, in an irregular way, it undermines confidence in systems. The foreign minister just spoke about that very same phenomenon in her country, a country at conflict. If a country is at conflict, having people cross your borders without any idea of who they are and why they're coming is destabilizing. It's not that different when we look across the Americas. We've had a very significant movement of people across the Americas, and by the way, not just into the United States, into all of the countries across the Americas. That's undermined public confidence, and you see the same thing that's happened within Europe. So we need to start from a point of irregular migration across borders without any mechanism to manage, control, know who's coming. Actually, right now, there's not public support for the concept.
Are you concerned that it might get to the extreme to completely closing it down, If
yes,
you're taking it there, this is what I'm trying to feel, the tendency
that is the
goes.
failure of the system, because we have lived in a system where we have failed to completely understand the market forces that are driving migration and the pressures that are driving people to leave. And the primary response of many, many governments is to do more on border enforcement, rather than identifying what's driving people to leave and how do we address that issue. Now, if it's a long-term conflict, the answer is going to be peace, and that's going to take some time, right? But how many people first leave a country in conflict and go to a neighboring country? The vast majority of them do. Now, they move on because they don't find circumstances that allow them to stay and thrive and survive there. So that's, again, rather than just thinking about how do I protect my country by throwing up bigger and better borders, how do we actually get to the reasons why people leave and build out systems that work better? Now, I want to just take a moment to talk about the work that's happening in parts of the economic communities in Africa to enable people to move safely, to innovate, to create regional development that will benefit and take advantage of both the resources, the human capital, but also the resources that exist on the continent. So thinking about this as how do we develop the Southern African region? How do we develop the East African community? How do we develop the West African community in ways that think about the movement of people?
Yeah, and yet I'm still going to go a little bit more into the possibility of kind of extreme closing those borders, because this is something that we've been seeing over the Americas. Now we have also Donald Trump back in the White House. We've heard some of the first decisions, but it's also happening across Europe as well. These are some of the decisions on the national levels here. When it comes to the situation of the Americans, and now the decisions we've heard, the first of those we've heard of, how concerned are you?
Well, specifically about the closing of the borders, I mean, it's something that will immediately affect more of, I think, the U.S. economy. There's a lot of the workforce that comes into the U.S. that is coming in, and with the labor shortage in the U.S. as well, is filling in all of these gaps. So I think there's going to be a big negative aspect when this happens. I mean, from my perspective, and also one of the ideas that Trump threw on the campaign, the immense tariffs that he's going to impose to Mexico and the trade wars that I think our region is going to be one of the winners, and I think it's going to be one of the directly dealing with the causes of migration. I think once you put a tariff to Mexico, all these companies, talking about positively from my perspective, you put a tariff in Mexico, all these companies are going to look for the next best option to do these products, to manufacture, and we're right there. I mean, our region, Central America, we're 2 days in a boat ride to the United States. So I think in that sense, we're going to be one of the winners, and it's really going to help the problems that we're facing right now. It's going to create a huge problem in Mexico because it's going to create massive unemployment, and if this were the case, and in the time that he's proposing. But I think that any idea of closing the borders, of putting these tariffs, has to be done in some timely manner, so that all these negative challenges can be worked from.
Yeah, in a more structural way, you mean, with the approach to that. Let's bring the second question, please, on slide. Okay, still 8713. Let's bring the second question, please. I would like to ask the team. You can still use that. There we go. What are the perceived benefits of a more open migration policy? And this is where we're going to have a few options, and we're going to ask you to please vote. So we have increased labor force, a boost for innovation and entrepreneurship, addressing aging population, cultural exchange, and other. Now, the trick here, of course, that you might want to vote for a few of those, but you can't. You've got to choose one. That's what we do here. And that's when I would like to ask you, which one do you see? You might agree that 2 or 3 or more of those are important, but choose the one that you think, there we go, 50-50. Okay. Please keep voting. We're going to keep that open. A boost for innovation, entrepreneurship, increased labor force, addressing aging population, cultural exchange, and others. Amy.
So I got to take issue with the question, because it's actually not about a more open migration policy. It's about a migration policy that actually looks at the demographic and labor market trends in your country, and then creating a migration policy that's fit for purpose. So take the United States for a minute, right? They have a very, very limited number of visas for persons to come in who are lower skilled. You know, it's about 66,000 a year. Think about all, as the minister has just pointed out, all the lower skilled sectors: construction, manufacturing, air conditioning repair, elder care, right? The whole range. And 66,000 visas is far below the needs of the United States to meet their own labor market and demographic needs. So it's no wonder that there has been a system that has developed outside of the legal framework that now exists. So that's the problem. It's not necessarily a more open migration policy. It's a more relevant, fit for purpose labor or migration policy. That's what I think is missing. And then if you do that, you get all of the above. I know. So I don't know how you choose. I don't know how you choose.
Minister, what's your take on those? So we have now 40% about increased labor force, something that you've talked in details about. Interestingly, cultural exchange gets 6% only. Well, I know economically speaking, but that's still a huge aspect of migration policies.
I think people aren't taking into account food. If you put food on the table, does cultural exchange go up?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, come on.
That's true.
Absolutely. No, I would think that a boost for innovation entrepreneurship would be the most, from my view, the most important. Bringing, I mean, that's the beauty and the success of the United States, right? Bringing all the different views and constructing based on that. So.
Yeah. Minister, what's your
the
third
same
option?
The same, the second option also, and I think just as Amy pointed out, I think it is about making sure that whatever migration policy is in place is adapted to the respective needs of the countries, the context, because at the same time it also caters for greater protection.
Yes.
Because in the absence of such an adapted framework that reflects the needs, you don't have this parallel system that establishes itself, which means that you have, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions sometimes, that are actually being exploited because they're not taken into account through an honest migration policy. And I think for a country like the DRC, for a lot of other countries that see a lot of their citizens go abroad into other countries, into other economies, there is also a very valid concern to make sure that they are, treated well, and at the same time, it is very closely linked with the honesty, if you want, that is the foundation of a migration policy. The honesty of saying this is what we need, and this is how we shape our policy to make sure that we cater to those needs, and therefore we also cater to making sure that they are being, responded to in an adequate manner that does not expose people to trafficking, that doesn't expose them to exploitation, and make sure that they are treated with dignity.
Well, I put that down because the fact of honesty being the base of migration policy, this is a huge...
I love that.
That's like...
so good. That
comes
should
with
be the
migration.
tagline.
Yeah, for sure. So are we changing? Well, we're changing a little bit. We have a boost to the answer and the boost for innovation, for entrepreneurship. No, okay. Okay. Still, we have over 40% increased labor force. That is that's something that seems to be the preferable option. 43. Cultural exchange, still 6%, because still no food. And others, no. Let's open the floor for the first questions. If you do have a question to our speakers, you can raise your hand and we're going to bring that up. And we're going to also maybe open those on Slido if we do receive any questions on there. We're going to have a question here. Yeah, and we're going to also have more of questions coming towards the end. But let's bring the audience. This is the town hall. We really wanted to have a very active debate and conversation with all of you in the room.
Sure, great. Well, thank you so much. I'm actually from Venezuela, which is a country that Venezuelans are the biggest migration crisis in the history of the Americas.
Yeah.
We're probably the second biggest migration crisis after Syria.
Yeah.
So Ms. Pope was mentioning that there's a system failure in the world and that we're not addressing the root causes of migration, and I completely agree. It seems that the solution is border enforcement or asking Venezuelans for visas or just delivering aid in Colombia or Peru or the US border. But things are going to get worse. This year we had disputed elections. There's estimates that more than 2 million Venezuelans could leave this year. We already lost 25% of our population in a decade. And we're reaching global levels of migration that we haven't seen since World War II. Mm-hmm. And those levels were controlled and were calmed down because the creation of a multilateral rules-based order that seems to be falling apart. Mm. So how can we create a new multilateral global rules-based order to address those causes and not simply treat refugees as a consequence, but treat the root cause that's making people leave their countries? Because nobody wants to leave their country. Yeah. No Venezuelan wanted to leave Venezuela. And how can we treat that, and how can we make also countries regain their people back? Because it's also generating huge losses for the countries losing its people. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you.
Amy, would you comment on that?
So I just want to take a minute. This is not a one-for-one answer, but I just want to put something on the table. The United States last year spent about $20 billion on border enforcement. The European Union did about the same. That's $40 billion being spent on managing borders. What if we take some of that money and we invest it in efforts to create peace. We invest it in efforts to create development opportunities. We invest it in a much more comprehensive solution. I mean, what's playing out right now is a failure of people to be engaging, thinking creatively, a failure to bring in other partners who have a stake when people move around the world, a failure to build out systems that think about the movement of people in terms of a much more complex international dynamic. And so, while I think the answer to Venezuela may be quite specific and it's part of actually a bigger conversation about creating peace and opportunities and governance and democracy, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, we tend to just think about the movement of people in isolation rather than as part of something that is much bigger. And we're funding at an astronomical rate the stopping of that migration rather than thinking about how do we invest in ways for people to move safely with dignity and in ways that drive development.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the other line. I'm just putting the thoughts of it. Was great to hear from you because the phrase that you said about nobody wants to leave their country, this is that voice. Thanks for bringing that up to this debate, because when we are talking from one point of view, but to hear that one, that really brings a lot to the conversation in this town hall. For sure, nobody wants to leave their country. Do we have another question from the room? Because I'm going to take it over there. Excuse me. Hi.
Hi. I'm double citizen of Switzerland and Italy. I wanted to talk more about my origin in Italy. So it's a little bit the problem that you addressed, Mrs. Pope. So Italy today.
Please state.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I repeat. So I will make a summarize. Yes, the question you addressed it. About the fact that the immigration policy is not in agreement with the needs of the country. This produces a lot of illegal immigrants, even if, to my opinion, nobody is illegal as a human being. And because there is an attraction in the country. So now, you said this much better than me, but how do we convince especially in Europe, that is an aging continent, governments that we until we don't have a policy that is in agreement with our labor force needs, we still will have this problem of confidence with, there's all this imbalance. And now everything that I heard makes a lot of sense, but somehow I am a little bit discouraged about national governments and the decision that they will take in the forthcoming years.
I actually would love to talk about Italy for a moment, because it is a government that is recognizing or has recognized the labor market shortages. And while being a very conservative government and very hardline on irregular migration, they are opening up labor pathways for people to come, including for temporary assignments to live and work. And that's important. I mean, whether it's done perfectly, whether or not it can be improved, whether, there's a whole range of conversations to be had. But what they're doing is reaching out to partners across many of the states of origin of migrants, talking to them about development opportunities, also talking to them about short-term labor migration opportunities. But I think more importantly than what governments can do, and the reason why we're here at WEF, is because it's not actually the government that benefits when migration is managed well. It's the private sector, it's the small town that is emptied of aging populations, it's the mayor of that town, right? So we believe the way to build coalitions at work are to engage the people who will benefit when it's working well. And it's one thing for a head of a UN agency to say we need a better migration policy. It's a totally different thing when it's the CEO of a multinational company that is investing millions of dollars, billions of dollars, and they say we need a better migration policy. So our goal is to bring together the various actors who have a stake in something that works better than what's happening right now, and help them to advocate, to bring solutions to the table, and to think about this issue differently.
Minister, with your portfolio investment, how much do you have of those, big businesses as well coming to you, and how do you motivate them to push for that change from their side as well, to make sure that it's treated differently?
Yeah, I've worked with many initiatives in the U.S. mainly to promote or to tackle the root causes of migration. One of which was headed by the Vice President Harris, tackling the root cause of migration for Central America. And the thing for me, they put a lot. The U.S. talking about the U.S. mainly as our most important economic partner. They put a lot of money into assistance for different things, but the problem that we have is creating jobs at home. I mean, yeah. The person that asked the question, they don't want to leave. I mean, Hondurans don't want to leave the country. So if you give them a good job, they're gonna stay. So I think the most important thing, and that's why it's on my line of work, is trying to bring more investments to the country. That's the only way we can hold our workforce in our country. So it really saddens me to see how much assistance goes into our country and how poor the investments are when they come to actually put their money where they say. That's where we have a lot of problems. There's a lot of talk of there's this amount of this fund available for investment, this amount money that never arrives to our country. The only money that arrives is all talking about assistance, and that's not going to fix the problem.
Would you want to add to that?
No, I think it's very pertinent,
Yeah.
and I think it's a
mentioned.
phenomenon you see in a lot of countries, and it's the same thing in the DRC. We definitely want to shift from a country that is perceived as a country where you invest, if you want, in humanitarian assistance, whereby there is so much other economic potential that's not being tapped into. And so it's also looking at attracting investment in a way also that helps us upskill our local labor force, but also attracting investment in a way that makes them think about also tapping into our diaspora. So this is something that we're trying to work on to see how do we make sure that, for instance, if we have a company that wants to, for example, start a mining business in the DRC, how do we make sure that we have mapped out our expertise that has gone out of the country, and how do we motivate these investors to, for example, mobilize them, be it on a short-term basis as a consultant, as someone who knows the language, who knows the context, and who can play that role for a short time, or as someone who is looking for a pathway to return home and, to invest in the development of the country. And so definitely the key to making sure, first of all, that we have better and better skilled human capital is drawing investment in, and not necessarily humanitarian or development assistance, but actually galvanizing the potential that we have through more sustained investments and industries and different areas in the private sector. And that's definitely also on the same line as what the minister said. Definitely.
We have about 8 minutes left. We're going to take more questions in 1 minute. Can I please ask you to put the third question on the screens? We do have that one, and I want to see the voting. So as usual, you scan the code, Slido, the hashtag WEF25. What are the greatest challenges the current migration policies are prompting? We discussed it a little bit here, but I do want to open the floor to the voting, and I want to see what's your take. Please do go there. Cultural integration, pressure on public services, pressure on housing markets, job competition, or other, the greatest challenges that current migration policies are prompting. We're going to leave that open. We're going to come back because I do want to give it a few minutes. And we're going to take the question here in the meantime, please. Hi.
Thank you. My name is Hawa Mufti. I'm from Nigeria. And in the context of Nigeria, we have a lot of forced migration, people moving because of armed conflicts and also climate change. So you see, for those kinds of demographies, the kinds of migration they do is not like safe. It's not. They do not get the kinds of opportunities we all are talking about here. So I'm asking, how is it possible to create safe and dignified migration pathways for those people in those communities?
Minister.
Well, ideally, of
'Cause you
course,
mentioned
ideally, you want to treat it at the root cause, of course. Ideally, you want to make sure that there's no more conflict. You want to look at what are the climate change patterns and how do they manifest in communities and how can you try to counter that. But these are long-term or mid-term efforts, and at the same time, you do have to think about the reality, which is also a staggering one on the African continent, of a lot of youths, especially, risking their lives to seek, better avenues and prospects. And I think this is where there is also a need to have very frank conversations about what are the main migration trends and to what extent do we have a responsibility in terms of managing them. And I think this goes hand in hand with all the other points we're mentioned about looking at workforce shortages, looking at economic patterns, and making sure that these people who at the end arrive somewhere, at the end still contribute to economies, but do not do so in a safe and transparent manner and in a manner that protects them. How do we make sure that they are also taken care of and, accounted for? So I think my answer will go a bit in the direction of a point that Amy Pope mentioned. It's also about how we broaden the conversation to include more stakeholders. So when we look at young migrants, for example, fleeing for economic reasons or due to economic reasons into Europe, for example, and the fact that the reaction is more to push them away, well, is this maybe a conversation that should not be just a European conversation, but actually a conversation that brings to the table African stakeholders and says, well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the fact that, we have youths risking their lives that are also entitled to protection, that are also human beings entitled to dignity. How do we solve this together? But unfortunately, we do find that a lot of these conversations and these reflections happen in an isolated manner and in silos. So you have a lot of communities, you have a lot of governments in Africa thinking about how do we find a solution to this? At the same time, they don't necessarily engage with the destination or with whatever is attracting the youths out away from their home countries. You have then communities in Europe feeling threatened or feeling overrun and not necessarily engaging in a conversation with where these migrants, so-called illegal migrants, are coming from. And at the same time, you have a business sector that somehow still benefits from it. So it's also about thinking how we broaden those spaces and how we make those tables larger so that we have a more comprehensive understanding of these migration patterns, their repercussions, but also their added value, their benefits, and having a more frank conversation about it. It does not necessarily mean that a solution will be found, but I think it is a greater pathway to more accountability and responsibility of knowing that you have everyone around the table who has a stake in it. And I think this can be also a way on the shorter term to engage in more constructive reflections and also lead the way to also address longer term challenges.
And you've mentioned here, it's something that we touched upon a little earlier during the debate regarding the change of the narrative and the change of perception. When it comes to those destination countries, it's also about how they perceive that, how the populations perceive that, the governments, and in general the societies, because this is another thing about the negativity that might be there or the concerns that might be there. It's not about taking that, it's about them also changing the narrative there for those destination countries to feel lucky to benefit from that, because they are taking all the high-skilled workers, and about also benefiting and profiting from that as well at the same time, isn't it? But when it comes to the conflict-driven migration, this is also, of course, another issue is that I myself am coming from the country stricken by conflict, and it's about you can't wait for the moment when it's over to start rebuilding or to start trying to get those people back. You can't, because if you wait, you're going to lose them. You're going to have the generations of those who are already born and raised into that. Exactly. And you're just going to lose that possibility. That's a different take, and that work should not be postponed for after. I think that's a very important just aspect for this specific migration when it comes to that. We do have 1 minute, 30 seconds. I'm going to take one very quick one, and that's, you have the mic.
Thanks. I'm Alejandro from Mexico. So how would you approach this new political narrative that I think sometimes is contradictory with the economic fundamentals? And let me put the case study of just what's going to happen now with the Trump administration. If you see the fundamentals, you have low unemployment. And if you see illegal immigrants right now, maybe 1 million work in construction in the US, maybe 800,000 in the food industry, 700,000 in agriculture. And he changed the migration policy. So how should you approach it? Because I think right now the world is facing this contradiction between political discourse and economic fundamentals. So,
and that's going to be the final thought, please. I have to, Emmy, what's your thoughts on this?
So I'm going to make a bold prediction because we're at WEF and that's what you do.
That's
right?
what we do.
And my prediction is that by 2050, and in 2050, countries like the Republic of Korea, Japan, and countries across Europe will have 40% of their populations will be over 65. So my prediction is that by 2015, the states right now that are pushing hard against migration are going to be fighting to attract migrants in all sectors for all skill levels, right? So my then advice, recognizing sort of looking down the road to 2050, is that we need to change the dynamic now. We need to change the frameworks now, and we need to move away from migrations just about the interior minister or the border minister and bring in the social affairs, labor, education, healthcare, and think about this comprehensively.
Thank you. Minister, briefly, your thoughts on the question.
Well, I think that what the changes in policy that are going to happen for Mexico and Central America based on what Trump has said, I think that there's going to be winners and losers. I would hope that it would take time for any of these, of everything that he said, gets into work. Yeah.
Thank you. Final thoughts.
Well, considering when we see big global trends that are looming ahead, and very often we do have data, we do have information that forecasts, certain patterns, I think it would be a missed opportunity not to seize the momentum that we have now, not to actually tap into the window of opportunity we have in order to see how do we rethink migration in a constructive manner, and not how do we respond to even graver crisis than we can expect, or that we're living through right now. So I think this is again one of these test cases, if you want, of our capacity as a humanity to learn from past mistakes, but also to project ourselves in a bold manner in the future. And
we bring that to the test with the forecast for 2050,
exactly.
and then we check what happened, and we put that on the vote.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for the speakers. Thank you so much, Thérèse Kayikwamba, Wagner, Minister of State, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Miguel Medina, Minister of Investment of Honduras, young global leader, and Amy Pope, Director General, International Organization for Migration. I'm trying to wrap it up very quickly. I know your agendas are very busy. And thank you, everybody, for participating here and online. Thanks so much for this session.
Thank you.